Good afternoon, honorable colleagues of the 25th Nomination Council. I will be the presiding chair for the work session. We're going to go on to number one, call session to order at 2:10. Go ahead and take a roll call vote. Honorable colleagues, you can push your buttons if you're here in the council chambers. Okay, thank you, honorable colleagues. Okay, we're going to move on to invocation. Invocation was done at the HES committee meeting this morning by Chairman Vince James. So we'll go ahead and move on to item 2, recognizing guests and visiting officials. If there is none, we'll go ahead and proceed on to number 3, the work session topics. Okay, we'll go ahead and have our Jalissa read that agenda. Item A into the record.
Thank you, Pro Tem Johnson. Honorable members of the Naabik'Iyati Committee. This is Naabik'Iyati Committee work session. Agenda 1 called session to order, roll call, invocation. 2, recognize guests and visiting officials. 3, work session topics. A, introduction and purpose of work session. This work session is for legislation 0080-23, an action relating to the Budget and Finance Committee, the Naabik'Iyati Committee, and the Nomination Council, approving a moratorium on all future allocations from the unreserved undesignated fund balance UUFB, the CHSN fund, and permanent fund income. On August 24, 2023, the Naabik'Iyati Committee tabled legislation 0080-23 to hold a Naabik'Iyati Committee work session before the Nomination Council fall session. That was motioned by Honorable Norman M. Gay and second by Honorable Stephen R. Arvizo, with a vote of 14 in favor and 2 opposed. 1, report by co-sponsor of legislation 0080-3. Presenter is Carl R. Slater. 2, discussion and comments. 3, final recommendations. 4, announcements. Close of work session. Chair Pro Tem Johnson.
Thank you, Jalissa, for reading that into the record. Okay, we'll go on to report. We'll go to the presenter, Honorable Vice Chair, Honorable Carl Slater.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much for convening today to discuss legislation 8023. As you heard previously, the legislation was tabled at the Naabik'Iyati committee, and the purpose of that was to have a work session to discuss questions or have a more free-flowing exchange of ideas related to the legislation. And I'm sure you've reviewed it in anticipation of this meeting, but a recap of the legislation is that it would authorize a moratorium on expenditures out of the undesignated unreserved fund balance, commonly known as the UUFB, the Citizen Fund, and the Permanent Trust Fund income, with the exceptions of the funding that's made available in the annual budgeting process pursuant to the current 5-year Permanent Trust Fund income expenditure plan. And the rationale behind the legislation is manifold. One, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in uncompleted capital projects here in the Navajo Nation. And we have yet to have a comprehensive plan to address all of those projects, many of which now have substantial unmet needs because of cost increases related to construction prices and inflation. And one way that a legislature can enforce discipline on the executive branch and seek performance is not to provide further funding into entities that are not able to complete their tasks or their charges within a timely manner. And that's just talking about projects that are from the Navajo Nation funding, or maybe they involve some state funding. In addition to that, we still have $1 billion in ARPA fiscal recovery funds to spend. And we need to dedicate ourselves as a nation to completing those projects within the timeframes outlined under federal law and federal regulations, in addition to our own Navajo Nation laws. I personally believe, based off of the lack of output and the minimal resources that have been available to the Division of Community Development and the Capital Projects Management Department, that we can't do all of these things at the same time and complete the ARPA projects in accordance with the timelines provided. And so as a legislature, as the council, as the governing body, the purpose of passing this legislation would be to demonstrate that we're going to be fiscally serious, that we're going to focus on performance, that we're going to focus on getting things done. And that is a message that we need to convey to the executive branch. And this year, we all voted for an annual budget that provides additional resources to the Capital Projects Management Department. At our Budget and Finance Committee meetings, and I think maybe at some RDC meetings, we've had conversations with DCD on how they're going to piece together a comprehensive plan over this next year to tackle all of the outstanding projects, to sift through the data and look at what is required from a human resources perspective, what's required from additional financial resources, and there may be things that we're not going to be able to accomplish with the budgets that we have and the funding that's available. So that is, in essence, some of the capital projects logic behind this legislation, that we shouldn't be burdening the executive branch with more capital projects. Instead, we need to focus on getting out the door what we've already allocated, in many cases over 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. We need to see those projects come to fruition. I have, for example, a cemetery fencing project I think received funding back in 2018, and not a single fence post has gone into the ground despite the funding being available, additional funding going into the project. And in trying to move this project through CPMD, it is just so clear that their project managers are overwhelmed with projects. I think they're doing the best that they can, but for us as a nation to continue to add projects without additional staff and resources is a serious issue. Second, I forwarded an email that contained a few different attachments. One of them is a memo dated today from Robert Willey, the accounting manager at the controller's office, to the three branches. And it provides an update on the balances in the CSN. So in the CSN fund, we have about 153 or almost $154 million. Of course, that's the unaudited, unappropriated balance, so subject to further revision by the controller's office. Now, the way that the CSN fund was devised, there's no revenues that come into the fund with the exception, or external revenues that go into the fund. The only way that it makes money is if we allocate money into the fund, which we haven't done recently, or if there is interest income from the method in which it's invested. And so there is a very large balance. If you look at the total assets of the fund, I think it's Exhibit A to the memo, there's $645 million in there. And you'll see the committed projects under that. And essentially, that 645 includes all of the projects. And you see the last item there says unallocated, line 34, $153,776,618. So that's if we just do some, back of the napkin math, and you do 645 minus 153, that's about $492 million worth of capital projects that have been allocated. And we need to think seriously about how, as a nation, we're going to use this funding. Are we going to spend it until there's no money left in the fund that's unallocated? Or are we going to seek to preserve this fund and look at different methods for making allocations? One of the unique features of the CSN fund is that it can be leveraged. And that means, we could, say, pledge some of the money that's in there as collateral, and then look at getting investment income and paying off some sort of bond or note over a period of time, or a loan or something. And I think that that's something we really need to think about seriously. We need to look at how much money has been committed and what we could do to accelerate the delivery of the projects. Maybe that's through some bond financing, but enforce a discipline and have a comprehensive logic on how we're going to move forward with this fund. I don't think we're conveying strong governance to the Navajo people when we just keep spending without any sort of message saying, well, at this mark, maybe we'll stop spending, or at this mark or at this time period, we're going to revisit the fund legislation and look at ways to appropriate additional funding into it. There's all sorts of different ideas out there. I mean, maybe you put the rest of this money into the permanent trust fund and try to increase the allocation that we get each year in interest income. I want us to have that conversation, and I hope that today we're able to initiate or have a piece of it, because our people and our future generations are owed that. They need to be able to reflect and look back at this government and say, they were responsible with our funding, they were thinking about the limitations that we have, and I'm proud to be a Navajo citizen because of the decisions that my government has made. Now, also contained in that email is the revenue projection from this past year. And that was issued on March 30th, and that memo just says memo to branch chiefs revenue projection 24. And if you go to the second page, you see that the recurring total is about $216 million. So say that's the gross revenue into the nation from, leases, from sales tax, from all the different ways, royalties that we collect money as a government. Then, of course, we're familiar with the set-asides that exist, 4%, into permanent trust fund, I think 2% over into the Veterans Trust Fund, all the different set-asides that we have. And this year that totaled $55,388,000. So that left us with $161 million. From there, we added in $40 million in permanent trust fund income, and that brought, sort of the base planning amounts up to $201 million. From there, we're familiar, there were additional unmet needs from which we took the excess permanent trust fund income and allocated those dollars to those unmet needs. So we've been relying as a nation for the past few budgets on this permanent trust fund income. And we have not really increased our revenues to make up for the ceasing of royalty payments, pit taxes, other taxes that were paid to the nation related to coal production at Kayenta Mine, and then also the Navajo generating station. So as a nation, we need to think about, with limited resources, declining revenue to the nation from taxes, how are we going to create an economy and a tax base that will be able to support the government services that our people deserve and that they've asked us to provide them? And I think that is the third piece of this legislation and the intentionality there. With, say, $150 million left in CSN, what are we going to do? It can be very easy because of the absolute magnitude of needs on Navajo to spend that money. There's requests right now from Navajo Prep, I think from Coyote Canyon Rehabilitation Services. There are a variety of different legislations out there that are seeking funding from the government. And, you look at them, you're like, okay, that's something, the government could do. Something that governments do. They support capital construction, they support education, they support people who are vulnerable, support people who have disabilities and need assistance to live a life with dignity. But at the end of the day, there does need to be a balance with investments into economic development projects. And they have to be the types of projects that will help bring dollars into the nation, right? It can't just be circulating the same dollars that we have here, because that's how you grow an economy, is you're bringing dollars from somewhere else, and then you, as a government, hopefully get a piece of that to support the services that you're trying to provide. So with that, I'd like to hand the gavel, or not the gavel, but I guess the mic back over to our Chair Pro Tem, Casey Johnson, Honorable Johnson. But those are the three main concepts behind this legislation. And I hope that we can discuss some of those ideas or discuss issues that individuals have with the legislation in particular. One thing I'll mention is that this was tabled, but there wasn't a clear direction on what specifically wanted to be discussed, and so I provided some information I was able to obtain. I requested from DCD that they issue a memo or make a staff member available to be here, and the memo was supposed to include an approximate listing of, not necessarily a listing, but just a total or tally of all the projects that DCD has in its responsibility to deliver and what that total dollar value is in addition to that. And so I have not seen that come into my mailbox yet. If and when that does, I will send it out to the rest of the council. And thank you for allowing me some time to present on the legislation. Yeah.
Okay, Vice Chair Slater, thank you for your presentation. And at this time, I'd like to go to item 2 for discussion and comments from our Honorable 25th Nomination Council that are here in the chambers with us. Do we have any questions or comments regarding this presentation? Madam Chair Charles Newton, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem, Delegate Johnson, and thank you, Delegate Slater, for this legislation. I was reading through it, and as you know, Delegate Slater, in the past, I have sponsored legislation for UUFB funding to help assist with those, I guess, budget costs that have come down that were not appropriated through the budget. A good example is the criminal investigators and the cost associated with toxicology as well as autopsy fees, because we get our bill usually like around January or February from the OMI, Office of Medical Examiners, from Arizona and also from Utah. So I was looking at what you have here for the UUFB, and then also the citizen. So you have the citizen moratorium as well as the permanent fund income moratorium. And then the UUFB, it does state on all future funding allocations from the UUFB. I understand that, I understand what you're saying in terms of how much money is available right now that the Navajo Nation hasn't even begun to spend down on, and the fact that we are really far behind on a lot of these projects, and quite frankly, I don't believe that we're going to spend all that ARPA money on projects. So with this legislation, would it prevent me from sponsoring legislation for criminal investigations to help pay for additional, we already appropriate funds to help assist for some of those costs, but sometimes they go over that amount, which is why we turn to UUFB for those additional funds. Will it allow me to be able to pull from UUFB for those for that specific reason where maybe unmet needs were not met during the budget appropriation? Does this only apply to projects where there's going to be build out? That's my question, because it's not really clear in the legislation. It does have just the moratorium, UUFB moratorium under A. It just says on all future funding allocations from the UUFB described in 12 NNC section 820. I don't believe that the ARPA funds would be made available for those instances where unmet needs may not have been met. And you know, as you know, we also didn't do the carryovers as well. So I support the legislation and I support what you're saying, because I think it is true. But at the same time, I just need to know what are the parameters in terms of the UUFB and with the unmet needs that are currently out there for our divisions and departments. Some of those unmet needs cover like equipment, like computer equipment. Some of them, you know, cover things, like I said, with the bills that come in later from OMI for criminal investigations. Some of it, you know, it covers maybe shortfalls that have happened. So can I get a little bit more information about the UUFB moratorium? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This time I'd like to give the floor back over to Vice Chair Carl Slater. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Delegate Charles Newton, for your question. I think there's one overarching question and then a few specific items under that. So overarching question is, would this prevent subsequent UUFB allocations from the, of course, annual comprehensive budgeting process? And the answer is yes. This would be a moratorium on all types of expenditures. And I think second question to answer is there a distinction between capital projects and, say, unmet needs related to Navajo Nation programs? And the way that it's currently constructed, there is no distinction between those two. And so it treats all expenditures equally out of those three different funds. And of course, you were referring to the UUFB specifically about the unmet needs related to the criminal investigators. I do believe that I remember when you came before the Budget and Finance Committee and presented the budget for the programs under the Law and Order Committee's jurisdiction, you identified this need for the toxicology and medical examiner, and I believe that we funded it for this year. So I hope that that's not something that we would need to make a subsequent allocation this year. Now, in the event that that comes up, or that's something that you already hear is coming down the pipeline, I'm really open to hearing your thoughts on that and colleagues' thoughts on, when there is a pressing essential government service that is not going to be provided, how would we address it in that manner? And I think when you look at the federal government, you look at the state governments, they generally make one budget each year, and it can be just as messy and tedious and arduous as it is here on Navajo. I would say it's probably worse in those other places. I think we did a great job this year, and we appreciate your committee's leadership in providing a very comprehensive list of unmet needs. But they don't have an ongoing spigot from which anyone can come and try and fill up their jug. And I think that doesn't reflect well on the government because we are less disciplined in our budgeting process, right? All it takes is one of us here to go to Legislative Council and say, I need this money, we're gonna do this. And I've seen in the 24th Council in which I was a member and starting to see in this council, really that spigot just open up. And there isn't a set of principles aside from divining how people vote, what the government means and what the council means with its allocation process. And what is a legitimate allocation at what time and what should be really a part of the comprehensive budget. And it's going to be incredibly interesting this year based off of Delegate So and your legislation, Honorable Charles Newton, to see what the reversion is back into the UUFB based off of not having any carryovers. So I would like to think as a nation we are moving toward a more disciplined set of budgeting considerations based off that legislation, based off how we passed the budget this year. And I see this as the next step in that process. So I hope that answered your question. And you raised also the bills, computer equipment, other things that maybe are unmet needs within each of the programs. But that's the purpose of the legislation, to have this conversation and to hear, okay, are we going to say only essential government services that are going to be impeded can move forward with a UUFB allocation, so that we're not spending a lot of time just trying to get and squeeze money out of Window Rock, but instead we're trying to increase the performance of Window Rock so that for those hundreds of millions of dollars just out of the CSN, was it 450 million bucks, that we're at least making a dent in, 490 million, right? that we're at least making a dent in getting those projects out the door. And then when it comes to program performance, saying, we're going to hold you accountable, executive branch. You need to complete the services you are tasked with the funding that you have. And if you can't, then in the annual unmet needs consideration, we'll look at applying additional funding to your program, but that has to be balanced with everything else on the nation. So, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carl Slater. Madam Chair, does this, okay. I'll go to, go to, Dr. Andinez, Honorable Dr. Andinez, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem and Commissioner Honorable Slater, for the summation of the legislation. So I know when this came as a deferring to a work session, one of the questions I had posed was if DCD would be able to project the outline of all projects currently funded within each of these funding sources, and if perhaps we would use that as a template or a formula to go with page 404, letter G. I guess I'm just kind of looking at timeline-wise, just kind of having an understanding of what we need to do as a council on our end, or if any of these projects are also within our constituency, to be able to support the projects so that it's completed. And if that's something that the Division of Community Development then would be able to produce in time for fall session next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Dr. Andinez. Vice Chair Carl Slater, you have the floor.
Thank you for the question, Chancilla. Let's see here. I think as I understand it, you're saying, do you want a listing of all the projects, or do you want the plan for completing all the projects, or is it both? Both, okay. For those of you on the line, the defendant nodded his head. It is so quiet and not filled with the joy that I enjoy in this chamber, so let's laugh here. Thank you, colleagues. So I have not been able to obtain that sort of document. There were attempts in the last council when it came to funding some of the, I guess, unmet needs of capital construction projects from prior allocations to understand what the comprehensive unmet need is within CPMD/DCD projects. And I remember seeing a limited list of that, and I was trying to find it in my email to show the council. I think there might have been some maneuvering at that time too, where they didn't want to volunteer a lot of information on some projects that maybe had substantial unmet needs, or they just weren't being prioritized at the time. But it's something that the Budget and Finance Committee has requested of DCD over the past few months, and something that we'll continue to request. And the information that they conveyed to us is that it'll probably take close to a year to come up with an actual plan to tackle everything that will have timelines and I think a real understanding of what the full project management resources are that are needed. So that's what we got from, at the time, Mr. Castillo. I know that Mr. Mitchell's over there now, and that's who I made the request to for the information today. So I will continue to work on that, and I hope that I can get it for you at the fall session. And that's something where you highlight item G, and I'll just read that, colleagues, in case you're unfamiliar, you don't have the legislation in front of you. It says, each of the moratoriums established in this action shall continue in full force and effect unless and until the Navajo Nation Council determines to lift one or more of them, either in whole or in part, via resolution adopted by a two-thirds vote of all sitting delegates and signed into law pursuant to 2 NNC Section 221B. So I think you're getting at, well, at what point would we lift this, and what are some of the criteria maybe that we would use to evaluate that? And I'm open to hearing from anyone here about what you think that might be. I think that Delegate Charles Newton raised a very good point, say, about essential government functions, right? We need medical examiner, toxicology reports, those things in order to have a criminal justice system and a judicial system that works effectively. And on the other side of that, you know, I've seen plenty of budgets come through that are wish lists and not things that I think are reflective of a government that has limited resources and needs to be very prudent and needs to be able to justify those allocations to our people. That's just something I think we ought to think about. You know, there's this one expression, and I remember reading it, I think in an obituary one time, but it says, conspicuous consumption is an insult to the working man. And I think as a government, we need to make sure that conspicuous spending is not an insult or an affront to our people. One such example being, I think, the Washington House purchase from the last council, which, of course, a couple of us who are returning voted against, Delegate Charles Newton and myself. So, you know, that's where I want to see us be strong appropriators and people that have strong accountability over our executive branch programs. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carl Slater. I'm going to give the floor back over to Madam Chair Charles Newton for a follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chair Johnson. So again, I support what it is that you're saying, and I agree wholeheartedly that right now the nation is not, we're not making any headway into getting these projects done. As you know, Delegate Slater, some of us still have citizen money that was allocated to us in 2018, hasn't even been spent down yet. And it's still sitting there at Division of Community Development. We did not have an effective DCD director last term, and we just learned that the new DCD director is gone. And we have an acting one at this point. So there's some turmoil that's happening within the administration right now. And that's why I'm just really reluctant to say that we're gonna be able to spend down the ARPA money. And I see what you're doing with this project, and I support it. I'm just really worried about some of the additional funds that come down from law enforcement and criminal investigations that we've asked for UUFB funding from before. And you are correct that those I guess those budget line items were already budgeted for, like the OMI costs. But as you might recall, we have almost every year gone over that amount. And so we've always had to rely on UUFB to come back to get additional funds to supplement those costs. And so that's one thing that I worry about as chair is if I vote green for this legislation and we're tying it up, I see your point and I agree 100% with you on the reasons why we need to do this. I just kind of worry that there are some services where they do rely on the UUFB to help them get through the year. Because as you know, Delegate Slater, sometimes our directors don't take everything into consideration when they come before our committees asking for funding. And that's what kind of worries me is this gonna stall that service? And would you be willing to include language in the legislation that would provide for, I don't know, those emergencies where, you know, it may affect the services provided to the Navajo people? I don't know. You know, maybe something maybe that's something you could think about, number one. Number two is I also don't see in the legislation, you know, what are we gonna do with that money? Is it just gonna sit there? I think you know, when we were there in New York this past December and we were getting information from our investors, I don't know if you were there the day when they had talked about how money just sits there, because that money just sits there and it's not being reinvested, or it's not like nothing is going on with it, it's just sitting there, that it really just looks bad on our books. So is this money going to be reinvested? Are you gonna put this moratorium and say, okay, we can't spend this, because we're gonna reinvest it and create more of that, that interest income that we see with the permanent trust fund income? Is that what you're planning to do with these funds? Or can we use these funds for leverage, to leverage, what's needed, with maybe, I hate to say other projects, because that's the point of this, right? Is we're saying, we have too many projects, we can't handle it right now. So that's the purpose of this, of dropping this legislation. But what are we gonna do with that money? Is it just gonna sit there? Or is there like something bigger that could be done? I like the idea of investing it, but at the same time, I get a little bit worried about the way that the market has been going. That I don't know if maybe, I don't know if investing would be the safest, the safest thing to do at this point. But again, what are you planning to do with that money? So this legislation passes, then what? It just sits there and it waits for us, to vote in 16 to go back to respending? Or, and keep in mind, Delegate Slater, that it would be the money from this year, and it would be the money from next year, and it would be the money from the year after, because ARPA, we have until December of 2026. So we know that that's gonna start accumulating, and that's why I support this legislation, because I'm seeing this as a way that we can reinvest those funds, because we're not, right now, we don't really have anything that is bringing back any revenue back to the nation. So this might be one way that we could do that as a council, because each year it's gonna be building. But at the same time, I'm just worried because we don't know at this point, if services are gonna be affected. How do we, what funding sources available to help us access some of those services? And then, what are we gonna do with this money while it's just sitting there? That's what I guess I would like to know. Are we gonna invest it? Or, what are we gonna do with it? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair Charles Newton. I'd like to give the floor over to Vice Chair Carl Slater for response.
Thank you very much for those really good points, Delegate Charles Newton. So I think the first one you asked, or you're still expressing the concern about these sort of essential government services and making sure that, in an emergency situation or something similar to that, we're able to make allocations that would support those services. And I think that you yourself or us together can work with the Office of Legislative Counsel to devise some language. I'm certainly open to that. I see wisdom in what you're saying there. And I'm just interested in if other colleagues have ideas about that or what the parameters they might want to see around it. What precisely is an emergency situation? And I hope that there's some root cause analysis that looks into why things that happen every year become emergencies as opposed to something that we address, right? And, we'll see maybe if there's going to be several $100,000 that comes back into the UUFB from the Division of Public Safety or from the police department. And could we have devised a way to make sure that they're actually able to transfer funding more easily? Or do they need to have a special fund that's set up in order to house that funding that's not subject to reversion, so they can, maybe their $10,000 left over this year, it will roll into the next year, and lo and behold, next year there's a $10,000 shortage. Maybe we can, I think there's a lot of different ways you could look at it, both on the root cause analysis and trying to strengthen program delivery. And then on the other side, I'm open to working on an amendment and seeing what that looks like. Now, the second item you brought up is, well, what's going to happen to this funding? And colleagues, I think it's worth, and I hope you indulge me, just to talk about the Navigation's investments right now, because it's important for understanding the response to Delegate Charles Newton and the concern that she raised. So, we have something called the Master Trust, and then there's different trusts that are under it, like Veterans, the Permanent Trust Fund, other items. We have a master investment policy for the nation, and then we have individual sub-policies for these different trusts. And depending on the purpose of the trust or the fund, you devise a strategy to meet those needs. And that will tell you what securities you can invest in, and then those marching orders are then provided to fund managers, and the fund managers then execute the strategy that we've tasked them with doing. And that's to say, not all funds are the same or are alike. There are certain allowable products that we're allowed to invest in overall, and then certain funds don't invest in those products because it doesn't make sense for the type of return that they're trying to deliver per the objectives of the creation of that fund. So that's it very basically. Now, we have some short-term investments, and that is generally things related to federal dollars, and we know, we're going to need to liquidate X amount so that it's available each quarter to support, whatever 638 contract, or maybe 638 is wrong, but some other type of federal program. And those are handled internally between the nation and Wells Fargo, and it's just very high-grade stuff. Since interest rates have been so high, we've been able to get some really strong returns off of those short-term investments. But that's something where, okay, if you're holding a lot of cash on the books or a lot of those sorts of products, and there's not a very strong return, then it looks peculiar, because that money, if it's just sitting there in a very low return sort of security, it should be maybe sitting in a different strategy where there's the potential to accumulate a much greater return over time and capital appreciation. So this money is in the PTF, it's in the Citizen Fund, and then it's also in the UUFB. I believe that the UUFB is not just held in cash, it's kind of a projection of what the needs might be. If there's legislations coming down the pipeline, then they keep abreast of that and will make sure there's enough funding to cover that when it's time to actually make that allocation. And then on the PTF and Citizen side, those funds are invested, and so it's not like they're sitting around and not doing anything. The income that we had this year was $60-odd million. $40 million of that permanent trust fund income went in, and that's what I mentioned earlier, the $161 million. You add the 40 to that, you get about $201 million, and that sort of became more or less our base planning amount between the different branches for this year's budget. The money that was in excess of the 40 million is what we used to cover some unmet needs here in the nation in our comprehensive budget process. And that's the money that we had available to us, and that's our biggest trust fund right now is the permanent fund. So on the Citizen side, they monitor, and PTF too, they monitor what allocations have been made. Of course, that money is then taken out for consideration for future appropriations. And they make sure that whatever products they're investing in are able to meet the project schedule so that contractors could be paid out, or consultants or whatever. And I think, they'll probably tell you it's an art and a science. It's not perfect, but they try to have regular meetings with CPMD to make sure we're able to pay out our liabilities. So this money, if we don't allocate it, will stay in each of those respective funds and will be invested according to those strategies. And Citizen, I think, it had one of the more aggressive strategies because they were looking at trying to really grow that amount of funding. And I believe our settlement was about $500-something million, and now we're up to 650, say 647 million. And that shows we've grown the money there while we've also made allocations out of it. Now, of course, if we, waved a wand, snapped a finger, and all of a sudden these projects were constructed tomorrow, there wouldn't be $647 million in there. There'd be like 150 million, like it says. So I think that's one of the issues I'm presenting before the council here. Are we going to use these monies to help increase our ability to deliver government services and in doing so increase the money that's available each year? Are we going to try and spend them until there isn't any? That's something I want us to consider. And, you know, just to share a personal preference, but that's not something that's really in the legislation or in the pipeline right now. I really think that we ought to consolidate all these different trust funds we have and instead each year decide, okay, we're going to focus on unmet needs for certain programs. The next year we're going to look at doing a modest capital outlay infusion into the Navajo Nation. Maybe have some sort of cycle or understanding of how we do that. But I feel like we differentiate and otherize ourselves when we say, you're a veteran, you're an elder, and this is where, you know, your money is, and that's not the Navajo people's money who are not veterans or not elders. Instead, I think there's a way to balance appropriations into all of those worthy projects or programs without having discrete funds or trusts set up. So, you know, if you rolled all that, say $650 million into the permanent trust fund, and you know, I would like to think that that would substantially increase, or hopefully would increase, the amount of money that we'd have available each year for unmet needs. And those program unmet needs that we look at each year in the budget process could be complemented maybe by a capital outlay unmet needs list. But that's something we won't know until, you know, we get that sort of comprehensive plan back from CPMD, or at least some more analysis on how we're going to complete those projects. And then in terms of the market, you know, it goes up, it goes down. You know, it's positive this year, and that's good for us. Last year was not a good year. So I don't know what to say about investing that hasn't already been said before, but at the end of the day, the nation has an incredibly talented investment manager in Jeremy Jimmy, has a very, very competent financial consultant that advises us on investment strategies, as well as advises us on the procurement of investment managers. And we have a suite of investment managers that do a very good job, and their performance is analyzed and tracked fastidiously by the investment committee and by our financial consultant and by the investment manager. And when there isn't the performance that we need, there are mechanisms for us to seek better management. So that said, this money would grow in each of those funds if it's not being allocated, in short. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Carl Slater. So, Madam Chair, Charles Newton still in the chambers. Okay, we're gonna go to move on to Honorable Crotty on the call. Which would like to ask. You have the floor, Honorable Crotty.
Okay, thank you, Yati Shaz. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. You have the floor.
Okay, perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you, Delegate Johnson. Appreciate the work session. Delegate Slater, what I was hoping to receive is additional information to support your legislation regarding the need to place a moratorium on spending. I understand, and I've listened to some of the suggestions that you're providing to the council on how additional or the unspent or unallocated citizen funding could be used in the future, and also possibly UUSC. What I've not seen is, other than the example of the Washington purchase, which I also voted red, was additional information on where you feel that spending was approved and either didn't meet the definition of CHASID eligibility, or looking at how these projects would not enhance the community that requested and were approved by council. That's the lens that I'm looking at right now in terms of the executive department implementing the projects. We have heard in our oversight from the Division of Community Development that in these allocations, we have failed to allocate the resources needed to actually to manage these projects. And so this budget, we added, just above the $3 million. I'm trying to understand and balance out your concern in terms of asking for a moratorium, but I don't really see the evidence that a moratorium is needed, because each allocation needs a vote by the council. Each UUFB appropriation needs a vote by the council, and if laws are waived, like for example, if council, if a delegate wants to sponsor legislation and it's deemed by the Office of the Controller as a recurring cost, and laws that are waived. And I am trying to see from what type of conversation have we gotten to the point where we need to discuss a moratorium. And because I'm trying to understand how we got to this point in particular, because it could be legislations in the future or legislations that are currently in the system that I would vote in favor of because they meet the criteria eligibility of either UUFB or CHASID. They would support and enhance services. And I'm just trying to see examples of, we use the term discipline. And so if you could shed light on where the areas you're concerned with in terms of these appropriations. And there's somewhat of a history with CHASID where individual delegates in prior councils would try to have complete control of the distribution of the CHASID funding. And what we've seen now is like the allocation, when you mentioned economic development, if you could provide any indication on what has been the rate of return for CHASID dollars that have been used for economic development, like for example, the allocation to the CDFI, the allocation to the glove manufacturing, and so I'm concerned that as these CHASID projects, and also, we have the agriculture investment fund that has used CHASID dollars. If there's really not a rate of return that's in the definitions or required in the expenditure plan, but where we do have some of that expectation is any type of investment utilizing the permanent trust fund. And so far the nation has only directly invested into gaming for specific economic development on Navajo Nation. And in looking at our investment portfolio, we can invest and support different industries. Although we get a rate of return, we're not directly in West. And so I appreciate the conversation. I just don't know at this point, and trying to understand your vision for this legislation, if it requires a moratorium, or as we move forward, we continue as a council informing our people and having a discussion on what is the plan, or what should be the criteria, or what should be the goals, let's say for this next fiscal year, to increase revenue, and what does that look like, and what are the tools, and how are we going to meet that revenue? But we have a 5-year plan with permanent trust fund interest income, and so I'm hearing a lot of different concerns, and I appreciate it, but I'm just trying to follow the rationale and what would be the end point. So is the moratorium, the intent is to place a moratorium to cure the discipline issue with the council, or is the moratorium to take a pause and gather all of the information and make comprehensive decisions on how to move forward? Or is the intent to re-envision the Sehasin eligibility for a specific purpose on economic development? Because the way that personally, the way that when I read the Sehasin, there's 4 areas, and an area that the council has not fully invested any true funding has been in education. And so I think that would be a conversation I would want to have on how the remaining Sehasin dollars could be used directly as an investment in education, so that, you know, our people, who are our greatest resource, have the resources that they need. And what does that look like? And I'm not just saying one specific area in education. There has to be all of these cross sections, including language revitalization, including how to get individuals back home, or at least creating a pathway for individuals to have access to a trained skill so that they can have a job and career to support their families, whatever that looks like, not in just one industry, but that could be in, you know, arts, artisans, craftsmen, welders, plumbers, to the IT, to the professional capacity. What is that goal then for investment? And so I think I don't share the same definition of what economic development looks like when it's just purely on a rate of return. But I would like to broaden that conversation. And so if it's through this legislation, I appreciate the opportunity to ask these questions, and also to have these high-level conversations. But how do we bring in some subject matter experts? So you mentioned our investment manager, and I haven't seen from the investment committee any type of proposals or any type of activity to look beyond just the stock market, and how, you know, that money is, you know, manipulated in different ways. There all of these different algorithms that they have, but how can we have a conversation on how to directly invest in our people? And so let me know if you're open to have that comprehensive conversation. And I think it takes 16 votes for Sehasin, and I'm just concerned a moratorium will, at this point, I'm just not seeing the evidence that we would need a moratorium at this point if our votes are still intact and we're all provided the same information, and have these conversations not only with our community members, but subject matter experts, and we can all get into the same, at least having similar goals or opportunities on how to move forward with this funding and future funding. There should be a dashboard for transparency in terms of not only all of the different trust funds and their management plans, There should be transparency on how they're being utilized. And in addition, I think when it comes to the money like UUFB, like it being some real, like, and if we want to do this together, giving like just the basic community education on what is the unreserved, undesignated fund balance, and what does that consist of, and then what is, the 10% that we have to keep to make sure if there is a projected shortfall. And every year in our budget, we're working off of projections. And we had talked about a 2-year budget. And so how can we make sure that when we're forecasting in the future, that we're able to have the funds that we need to keep critical government services? And this brings on the question then, what is considered essential? Who are the essential workers? And when asking what's the difference between general funds and state and federal funds that are being, the audit demonstrates that there's federal dollars that are in our coffers that haven't been utilized. And so the arguments that you're making for the CEJAS general fund are also arguments that we need to take into consideration for our federal programs, like the Department of Transportation or the 638 contract, where that's nearly like $500 million according to our audit. And so I think this is a larger conversation, and I apologize for the length of my discussion, but I really am trying to center in on the concerns for the moratorium. And I'm really trying to center in then how do we continue to have this conversation as a whole with the people being able to either call in or listen in, so we have additional education on what is going on with our funding, what's going on with our dollars, what does it mean to have permanent trust fund, 5-year plan, and if the intent is to have revenue, then I didn't see that as a condition of appropriation in the budget. So how do you envision looking at these revenue, whether it's by percentage or if you're trying to recapture the $40 million? Like, what does that look like, so that I could understand completely the intent of this moratorium? Or it may just be that you felt this was the best action by the council at this time, and so I could be just overanalyzing the issue. But placing a moratorium to me has there just needs to be additional information on why we would move forward, because there's a history of how we use CEJAS and UUFB that I think a moratorium would either severely delay or create a situation where the council is not able to appropriate dollars in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Crotty. At this time, I'm going to go to get the floor back over to Vice Chair Carl Slater to respond.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Shma, for the... I lost track of how many questions you had there. So I'm going to need your help in moving through that. But you are honing in on exactly the points that I am desiring to raise. And I think the overarching question you're asking is, what is the justification for that? And looking retrospectively at how to provide that sort of justification. What have we done in the past that's been an inappropriate allocation? And I think that's not exactly how I want us to meditate on that. I think, the point that you raised about, well, it takes 16 votes out of CSN, and, if you're waiving something because it's a recurring cost in a UUFB request, then it takes 16 votes anyways. So I see this as a forward-looking legislation that gives us space and time to answer a lot of the questions that you're looking at. And what I'd say on the rate of return and you know, the investments into our nation, there are laws that the Budget and Finance Committee has passed, the regulations, and those are the marching orders to the Investment Committee. And then they have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that our capital is preserved and that we get a rate of return consistent with the investment policies that we've set forth to support those different funds. And if we want to change that, then that is our opportunity and, you know, our privilege as delegates to do that. And I would be happy to work on that with you if there are items that you want to see change in how investments are made by the nation. I think fundamentally at the end of the day, we can broaden what economic development means in that definition, but someone has to pay for it. And in the absence of an economic development plan that has buy-in across the government, that has buy-in from the people, we're just going to keep spending without seeing new businesses open, without expanding our tax base. And we'll probably see some good, you know, tax revenue over the next few years related to the expenditure of the ARPA dollars. And then, of course, or the FRF dollars, and then other ARPA and CARES Act funds that have been available and will be spent by programs. But I want us to think, well, okay, are there other direct investments, like you said, that we can make? But what I have observed from being a delegate on the 24th Council, and now on the 25th, is that there's a tremendous amount of effort put into developing appropriations requests. And if we look at what happened at the end of the 24th, they basically all expired when, you know, we had that special council session, was on the 30th or the 31st, and that's it, that's all, folks. You know, they did not, maybe the 25th, I don't remember what day it was. We were not able to get them over the finish line. And I just think about how we as leaders need to look at ensuring that funding that's been made in the past, those allocations, whether it's for programs or for capital projects, are being delivered in the best way possible. And I think that this gives us some of that breathing room. In terms of the distribution of CISN and PTF dollars, you know, there are some delegates who exercise self-limitation or restraint and have a political philosophy related to what is important and what's not, and what allocations should be made. But I have definitely heard you in the past, Delegate Crotty, speak about the need for the transparency in these allocations and how they're made. And I hope that this would give us room to make that, to demonstrate it, to convey it to the people, to each other. There's like an echo thing going on here. Do you know? I think the mic is too low? No? Okay. Well, I hope it's not annoying to the folks on the line. The legislation, I believe, would provide that and give us the space to think through some of these issues. I don't want us to be, as a council, and I hope that, you know, through this act, if it passes, that we'll focus on accountability and program and project delivery instead of spending a lot of time, and you know, in particular, the limited time that's available to the Office of Legislative Counsel. And we look at these cycles, right, nearing each quarter when we're approaching the council session each quarter, where, you know, they get a lot of pressure from a delegate to prioritize an expenditure, and it effectively removes those resources from other delegates, say, who are trying to go after policy changes or improve our people's lives or the operations of the government in another way. And I hope that we can focus on substantive policy improvements as a council and make that a premier and defining feature of the 25th Council. The point about education and the point about not really making any education appropriations out of CIHSN. I attempted to pass a resolution in the last council that would have appropriated $50 million into the scholarship, well, into a fund, a scholarship fund that we would create. And I see a lot of wisdom in the nation providing funding into scholarships. I do have to raise, one concern, and that is, I remember taking like a personal finance class in college, and it was just a short one. This very noted economics and finance professor taught it, and he said you can always get a scholarship for college or for higher education. You can't get a scholarship for retirement. You can't get a scholarship for government services. And I think that that's something that we need to think about, is how much money we're willing to put into scholarships and what that will meaningfully do for the student. Because you could put 50 million bucks in and we're still not even going to make a dent in the overall need that exists there. But what can we do as a nation to create a stronger economic environment where there's more money coming in so that we can tax it and set it aside for our scholarship recipients? And parallel to that, how can we reconstruct education and hiring on Navajo so that we're meeting our non-traditional learners and we're meeting the employer needs of the people who have money and budget for these positions, and they don't end up having applicants, and so they stay vacant, or they have to contract the services out in a more expensive manner. And I want to applaud the council for making that allocation this year to do that with competency-based education and supporting a pilot project that I really think will hopefully provide some lessons learned, but a template in how we can revisit chronic vacancies on Navajo everywhere from project managers to nurses, and how we can get more income into our households. So I think maybe the last, I shouldn't say the last, you had so many good points. The point about direct investments, again, I think that goes into, if you want to see, or if any delegate would like to see direct investments into either Navajo businesses or into companies that would somehow benefit the nation, I'm happy to have that conversation. I just think, at the end of the day, right, we're the ones who create the parameters from which the investment committee makes decisions, and we have the ability to broaden them. But we have to be very careful. Most small businesses fail, and it's very difficult to assess how to make those types of investments. And we as a nation will hopefully be receiving SSBCI funding soon to make those sorts of loans or equity investments into small businesses. So I'm sure I did not answer all the questions that you have, and I'm welcome to continue as you make your questions available. So thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. At this time, I'd like to give the floor back over to Honorable Crotty for any follow-up questions or comments.
The discussion on some of the questions that I asked that you were needing to get to, but because I'm just trying to understand the intent and why a moratorium. It's a very restrictive. I'm seeing this as a very restrictive legislation, and I haven't seen the evidence yet to support restricting additional allocations in understanding the eligibility factors of CIHSN and UUSD, and if the intent is to increase revenue, we still can have a discussion with our enterprises and the amount of dividends they return back to the Navajo Nation. They are set up by the Navajo Nation government that for the benefit of our people, and historically they have not provided the dividends that in an equitable manner. And so I think that goes into also the cross section with shareholder representatives in advocating for the dividend to be created, and it could be, as we're able to create these fund management plans in the past, in addition to your scholarship initiative for Sehasin, I attempted to put additional money into the Senior Citizen Trust Fund that failed, to put money to and create a youth trust fund that I believe was never voted on, and so I think there's areas where we could continue to utilize these dollars to help offset some of these systemic issues like lack of resources that as a government we should be providing to our people. And I think putting a moratorium on funding that could enhance these services and not looking at all of the resources we have on the table, which includes our enterprises and the dividends that we should be seeing, that then wouldn't overly tax or put the tax burden on either small businesses or individual Navajo citizens who are simply trying to purchase, or whether it's gas or food or other utilities, whatever is taxed here on the Navajo Nation. The enterprises, in my opinion, have been sheltered and protected by leadership for too long. And we need to have a coordinated effort on what and their part in how they have been successful by utilizing either certain preferences, their status of their companies to access certain federal dollars. And so that's why I cannot see why we would want to put a moratorium on funding that, for the most part, has enhanced the community's needs. I also wanted to see if you had any thoughts. I just read the ARPA summary provided by Mr. Butero, and it looks like approximately $79 million. I wanted to see if you could verify this. If, in the way that I'm reading the summary, it looks like about $79 million of current Sehasin projects would qualify for ARPA reimbursement. Could you let me know if you have reviewed that document, and is that I could follow up with the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Program office, but I would want to see that if that's something and how we need to look at how ARPA may be, because for the majority of these legislation, we were able to get amendments in there that acknowledge if federal or state funds were available, then the primary source of funding, like Sehasin, would be reimbursed. And so that also, we can consider that. And I looked at the legislation we recently took action on to extend the Sehasin eligibility time period. So that 24 months is just also a very ambiguous term. There was no real data to really support why the council at that time would say 24 months. But we now have learned that has put challenges in terms of how we expedite and execute those projects. And it's my understanding that the ARPA or Navajo Nation fiscal recovery projects are priorities, where other projects that have, let's say, like a deadline to revert projects. So I just wanted to see if any of those areas were considerations that you made in asking or developing this legislation for a moratorium. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Crotty. To give it back to Vice Chair Carl Slater for a response.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Delegate Crotty, for the questions and comments. I think there were two thrusts there. One of them was focusing on shifting the tax burden or having the enterprises contribute more. And I think the second one was about the reimbursement from different sources through ARPA. And I was hoping I could do some math while you're speaking, but didn't get to complete it all. So do you want to ask some more questions? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so I'll give you an example here. 201 million bucks, say that was the planning amount that we had this year for the money that we brought in after the set-asides and is available to deliver government services. Now, $201 million, right, this is what we can do anything with as the Navajo Nation government. It's not restricted by external funding covenants or anything. 201 million divided by 405,000 Navajos, that's 496 bucks per person for government services. $201 million divided by 175,000, the number of Navajos who live on the Navajo Nation, on the reservation, is about 1,100 bucks. And, you know, a lot of our people don't qualify for the federal funding because they don't meet the income requirements that are associated with those federal dollars that come into Navajo. And what I wanted to convey was the amount of money that would need to be, and really not just money, but like pure profit that would have to be generated by the enterprises to start making up really large sums back to Navajo to increase those, say, per capita allocations. If we're just thinking about, well, what can, your expectations on what the government can deliver might be in line with $1,100 or with $500 if we're just talking about those services that are funded out of the 201 million. Now, I wish I had been able to finish the calculations. I'd be able to show you that. But I don't want to get bogged down into the enterprises. I think that's a very large conversation that, of course, is a part of this because it comes back to tax revenue and dividends and all of that. But the only comment I'll make is, we as a council can reorganize all of them. I think there's only one enterprise that has a mandatory dividend payment back to the nation, and that's Nadani Development Corporation. We could consolidate all the enterprises into one organization and then say, based off the profits you make, you're going to decide internally what you allocate to each company, but you owe us overall 20% of the profit that you made this year. I think that's what the dividend is there. And, that could be a substantial amount of money back into the nation's coffers, but it definitely would not be anywhere near 200 million. And I don't know exactly what it would be. But I would like us to consider that, and I hope that this conversation and debate that we're having today on this legislation encourages delegates to think of creative ideas like that. And with respect to the second question, if you're quoting 75 million, I have not seen any new document from Mr. Platero. I was just looking through my emails right now, so I don't know when that document was sent out, but I believe that that's consistent with the figures that have been refined for the past few months, or maybe over the past year, since the ARPA dollars are made available for us to make those reimbursements. I know we included in the initial calculations things that, as regulations have changed, are no longer reimbursable, and so I think we've been waiting to make those reimbursements until we have a lot more clarity and finality there. But yeah, it's true. It could be $75 million back into the one or other funds. I believe we also included a condition or a legislative concern in this year's budget, identifying or telling Navigation Programs to assess with the controller, with DOJ, what funds within their general funds budget may be an allowable cost under the Fiscal Recovery Fund ARPA dollars so that we can make reimbursements to our budget. And in theory, that would free up and make more money available in the UUFB. And that's a way to improve the finances of the nation as well. So, yeah, I think that's what I have to share in terms of responses. In terms of the point that was made that there isn't justification for the legislation, I think we're just going to have a disagreement on what we believe those justifications are. And in terms of getting additional information, I can work on that, and I'm happy to get with you offline and understand what specific elements you would like so that I can attempt to obtain those. And if there are any amendments that any delegates here on the line seek to the legislation, I'm open, right? This is the most basic version that you can effectively offer of this type of legislation. We've had a lot of really good thoughts today, and I want us to work together on this. And the whole point is to get accountability, get delivery of things that we've already allocated funding for, and to hopefully at the same time develop real strategies on how to make sure this is a sustainable government going forward. I'm not sure it's sustainable on the path it is right now. Here's the example. We get like $50 million a year for roads, right? That's not enough to take care of our own paved road system, let alone constructing or improving new paved roads. And yet, because of that central tension that our people demand and deserve improved roads, we continue to improve roads. But at the end of the day, unless we somehow get more money into this government to provide those services that isn't the federal government, there's no assurance that we'll actually be able to take care of that whole system. And there aren't enough grants in the world to take care of, all the roads needs that we have. And you can extend that principle to a lot of different services that we provide. So that's where, I want us to create a government and have a vision that our people can be proud of. And if it means sacrificing some allocations in the near term to create a more, let's say, sensible, widely understood, widely communicated plan to have that sustainable government, then I think we'll have done a good job. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Carl Slater. Let's ask Dr. Andy Nez. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Pro Tem, and also Shana, Honorable Slater. So this may be me just needing a little more education regarding the history of both the UUFB as well as the CHSN and a Permanent Trust Fund, but I'd just like to offer just some comments in areas that I've been thinking as Honorable Karate and looking in through CD 6814, which created the CHSN Fund, as well as its amendment back in 2018. But I know right now UUFB requires a simple majority. Perhaps there can be a requirement on that number of delegates as CHSN is with 16, and CHSN itself gets an increase as well to, let's say, 21 delegates, for example. That could allow for some restrictions. At the same time, I did quickly peruse the information related to CD 6814 as well as the amendment. So one of the things I didn't quite see, and perhaps I overlooked, but if you're using CHSN, for example, one of the criteria is on economic development, but there's really no percentage that would be given back to the nation's coffers as well. And perhaps that's in a separate amendment or legislation that would require of CHSN dollars. The other thing I was thinking about here was that you know, there was 16 delegates from the 24th Navajo Nation Council that was not reelected. But that 16 that were not reelected, in essence, had the majority and the numbers to pass any CIHSN projects. And I remember there was a number of projects that were being put into the council under the 24th at like the 11th hour when they were not reelected. And so that kind of puts our nation as well into a situation of not being fiscally responsible. And so I think a moratorium should be designated at least the last 2 quarters, if not the first quarter into the new fiscal year when you're approaching the election year. Granted that you certainly don't want to be fiscally irresponsible. After all, it is the people's money, and you just don't want to certainly submit all types of projects when in fact you're not returning on to the next council. That's something that I just observed from the previous council, and I think that it's something that I will continue to think about as we move forward in this 25th Navajo Nation Council. So I just wanted to highlight those areas. Perhaps it's been done in the past. Perhaps it's there's a reason that it's not being done. Again, this certainly is education on my part, but I just wanted to offer those comments. Thank you, Chair Pro Tem.
Thank you, Honorable Andy Nez. Turn the floor back over to Vice Chair Carl Slater for response.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Shatsila, Honorable Nez. So, very interesting ideas, and open to working with you if you want to come up with an amendment. I think it might strike a balance, and we should review this maybe with some of our other colleagues. And I know that we had a colleague who spoke earlier, and perhaps this could alleviate some of that delegate's concerns, that there still is a protocol through which you can make allocations, but you're increasing the threshold, and maybe we just institute a temporary restriction on that. When I say temporary, you know, it could be tied to time, or we could set some milestones, like we want to have a strategy from DCD. We want to have a strategy from the President's office for us and our communities to review on economic development. And then, you know, maybe tasking the Controller's office and some others to run the numbers, right? And say, okay, well, here are some different things we could do creatively with our investments that would increase the return, but you'd have to have a different allocation process annually. Or here are, you know, ways that other tribes drive revenue into their government coffers. You know, we don't really have like a growth fund or anything like that. A lot of tribes will like put money into a separate entity that is under the nation, and that's supposed to contribute money back to the nation, but it's not directly controlled by the elected leadership. And we don't really have that on Navajo, just an entity that's supposed to make money for money's sake. We've created discrete enterprises that focus on particular industries generally, and I think that's an interesting idea. So, Chair, Delegate Ness didn't really have any questions, but those are the comments I'll offer right now. Thank you.
And thank you, Vice Chair Carl Slater. At this time, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Andy Nez. Do you have any follow-ups, comments? Good. Okay. I'd like to go over to Honorable Nathan Nota. Thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Speaker Pro Tem. Also, Delegate Carl Slater, thank you for the resolution that you've put forth. I do feel that I understand the principles and the ideals of what you're trying to do. I think it's honorable and from that respect. I do, however, feel that some of the information that Dr. Nez requested at the beginning of this session, that would be helpful as far as me making a decision. At this point, I think that the two-thirds votes that Delegate Crotty mentioned, I think that's a good method of making sure that hopefully we can expend these monies in an efficient manner. For that reason, I'm inclined at this point to vote against this legislation. I do have a question. It does say here in the legislation, temporary moratorium. And it says, this action shall continue in full force and in effect unless and until the Navajo Nation Council determines to lift one or more of these moratoriums. In your mind, what would be, and this is to give me an idea of how long this moratorium could be, what do you feel would be like the plan, the criteria, in your thought process in putting this legislation forward? What would you think would those plans and criteria would be to lift this moratorium?
Thank you, Honorable Nota. Vice Chair Carl Slater, your response?
Thank you very much, Delegate Nota, and thank you for raising a really good point there. So, in comparison to what Delegate Nez brought up related to, I think it's kind of the same question, like when would this end? And I mentioned that it could be tied to certain deliverables, like, okay, well, we want to have the strategy from CPMD and, maybe get some sort of approval from RDC and Budget and Finance, or from NABI, and, we'd all devise some way to say that, we support this and therefore are willing to lift the moratorium. That's something that is important to me. I think CPMD, DCD, the Fiscal Recovery Fund Office, we got to focus on the ARPA dollars. We got to get them out the door, and we need to start contemplating what some of the, in case of emergency, break glass methods are going to be to make sure we utilize all that funding. And reimbursement of our personnel expenses within the Navajo Nation government, I hope, is something that we can get a handle on right now, but still would pale in comparison to the magnitude of money that we may have available unspent. Now, because there are legal questions about whether hardship can actually be authorized another time, because it has to be justified, and because there have been X number of hardships from the federal government and the Navajo Nation, it may become a question cost, and that would be hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars that the nation would have to figure out how to pay back. So CPMD, I think economic development, getting, not something that has down to the square foot exactly what that's going to look like on Navajo, but to adopt some principles where we as a nation are identifying what the political economy is that we want to build, right? There are certain limitations that exist here in the Navajo Nation where we don't have access to private land, right? And it gunks up access to credit. I think the number one way that small businesses are funded are they're self-funded through, some sort of, or from collateralizing one's house. And we don't have a way, because we really don't have a comprehensive residential real estate market here in Navajo, to build wealth within our families through home ownership. And so in the absence of some of these tools to increase the prosperity and intergenerational wealth transfer on the nation, we should be identifying how families will be able to support themselves, what the expectations are from the government, and what that economic development would look like over, say, a 5, 10, 20-year period. And there are a lot of countries that have been very successful in executing 5 to 20-year plans when they've gotten serious and they've been dedicated to a mission. But we would have to be very serious and dedicated as a nation through multiple administrations to make that happen. And it could be through Navajo Nation-run enterprises, bringing in dollars to the nation and then using that to support a contractor or a small business ecosystem. There's a big push to focus on industry, on manufacturing in this country, and of course in Navajo generally, or Navajo specifically. There's lots of economists who say, no, we should not be doing that. That's going to end up harming the U.S. economy over the long term. We should stick with services and other things. I can't look to anywhere in the code. I can't look to any administration that has clearly identified what the big question is that we want to answer, and that is like, what is the political economy of the Navajo Nation, and what is your vision? It's always the same platitudes of, I'm going to support small businesses, and we need jobs, and this or that. And, you know, it's convenient and seductive to use that same rhetoric, but, you know, that's something that I would like to see, is something that's serious, and, you know, has options, right? People can say, okay, well, if we engage in this activity, for example, mining or, you know, any sort of energy extraction, these are the expectations over here. Those are very well-studied industries, very sort of easy to create projections. Whereas if we, you know, say give money to regions and say, you guys can use this for economic development, and you're going to have local control over what that looks like. You know, is that just going to be a bunch of C-stores that provide modest employment opportunity and provide some better food access, but don't actually increase the overall, say, GDP of the Navajo Nation in any meaningful way? Those are the things that I want to see. And I want us to convey to our people that we're talking about, that we're seriously discussing, not parsing through votes and trying to decide, oh, I think this is where the nation is going. Like, all this subtlety I don't think has served the nation at the end of the day. And, you know, I'm not throwing past leadership under the bus, but the fact of the matter is that the only instrument and tool that we have today to make up lost revenues is the permanent trust fund. And we met that time period, and we didn't adequately diversify our economy and develop, I think, a real idea of what it means to have a Navajo or a Diné economy within the reservation in the 21st century, you know, a few decades ago, when the permanent trust fund was envisioned. And I don't want us to go another few decades and then, you know, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids of people in the room now are going to be saying, what'd you do? I mean, yeah, you got a store funded or whatever. So I think those are the two big things that I'd like to see. Economic development strategy that we can buy in and then use this funding to invest in, and then complemented with a strategy for completing outstanding projects. And those would be the two main things. If we're looking at a time frame, you know, what was shared at a budget and finance meeting is it'd probably take a year to analyze and develop the plan on the CPMD side to look at everything they need to do. That might change. There might be a different opinion from this new director, but that's what was shared at that time. So I would envision, you know, at least a year for one of those items. And then if you're going to do an economic development plan that, say, is conveyed to the people and involves their input, then, you know, we'd probably need at least a year to look at things that have been put together in the past, come up with a new strategy. And I think the onus of that would be on the executive branch with the resources they have available, with oversight and advisement from the legislative branch. But we'd need to have, you know, public hearings essentially, and that's something I'd love to see. You know, what are your expectations, right? If you want these things that exist off the reservation in terms of development, we can clearly line up and say, well, this is how much it would cost, this is the sort of tax base that's required, and here are analogous communities with these sorts of population levels, and, you know, that's how they're able to support X, Y, or Z. The Navajo Nation is a very tough market because it is so rural. There's almost no density except for a few spots here or there to be able to support businesses that we ideally want on the Navajo Nation. And so that then ties into complementing economic development. What sort of communities are we trying to construct? And that's going back to the political economy. What is the land tenure of the Navajo Nation? So I just hope that we're able to engage and have this sort of conversation, because I think all these things are related, and that's through one aspect that you see here, talking about how we invest our limited resources through UUFB, PTF, and CSN, that we can think more comprehensively and look at the interrelatedness of all these issues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Honorable Dr. Andinez, is that Sufficient for your response, or Honorable Nathan Nota? You good? Okay. Do you have any other colleagues in the chambers have any questions or comments regarding this work session? Is there anybody else online? Okay, we're on number 2, discussion and comments. I don't see any other discussion or comments. Do you have anything to add, Legislative Council, regarding this work session? Okay, thank you. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and move on to number 3, any final recommendations? Honorable colleagues of the 25th Navajo Nation Council. Okay, we'll go on to number 4, announcements. Are there any announcements? Close of work session. Honorable Vice Chair Carl Slater, do you have any closing remarks? I'd like to go ahead and give you some time for closing remarks before we end this work session.
Vote for the legislation, colleagues. Vote for the legislation. I kid. Dr. Nez, Honorable Nez, Honorable Nota, Honorable Charles Newton, Honorable Crotty. I think that's everybody who spoke. I'll try to reach out to you individually and see if there's input that you would like to provide into the legislation, and maybe we can devise something with the Office of Legislative Counsel. To the remaining colleagues who are still on the line or present here in the chamber, well, we just have Norman Begay here. Thank you for being here. Yeah, that I'm open to working on amendments. I'm open to working on the issues that I identified in the presentation of this legislation. And I sincerely hope that this council will address all of these interrelated issues. This is just one tool that I think is available to us, as appropriators. And it's one way for us to get performance. It's one way for us to get, hopefully, adequate return on